For 12 years, I ran financial literacy workshops at a community outreach center in Brentwood. I taught women, most of them married, most of them trusting, how to read a contract before they signed it, how to ask for the documents, how to understand what their names were and were not on. I believed in those lessons completely. I had not read the deed on my own home in 29 years. The locksmith was still packing up his tools when I pulled into the driveway. I watched him from behind the wheel for a long moment, not quite understanding what I was seeing. The way he zipped his bag closed. The way he handed something small and silver to the man standing in my doorway. The way that man, I recognized him immediately as Warren, my brother-in-law, signed a receipt without once looking up toward the street. My hands stayed on the steering wheel. My engine stayed running. I had been in Nashville for 4 days, visiting my youngest daughter, Abby, who had just moved into her first apartment. I had helped her hang curtains, assemble a bookshelf, and stock her refrigerator with things she would forget she owned. I had slept on a pull-out sofa and called it vacation. On the last morning, we sat on her little balcony with coffee and watched the street come alive, and Abby had said, "Mom, I'm so glad you came." I had driven home singing with the radio, feeling lighter than I had in years, thinking this was exactly what a life was supposed to feel like. I had called my husband Thomas every single evening from Abby's couch while she made chamomile tea in the kitchen. Every single evening he had answered. Asked me how I was sleeping. Asked whether the drive down had been difficult. Asked whether I needed anything. And while I was 300 miles away being a mother, someone had changed the locks on the house I had lived in for 29 years. Warren finally looked toward the street. Our eyes met through the windshield. He didn't wave. Didn't smile. Didn't do any of the things a brother-in-law does when his brother's wife pulls into the driveway after 4 days away. He just looked at me and then looked away. That told me everything. He had changed the locks on my life. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that my father had spent years making certain they couldn't be changed without me. I put the car in reverse. I drove to a hotel on West End, and I called my attorney. I met Thomas Calloway in the autumn of 1992 at a charity auction in Franklin, Tennessee. He was charming, the particular kind of charming that makes you feel chosen. As though out of every woman in a room, you were the one worth the effort of noticing. He bid on a handmade quilt that night and lost, and then immediately turned to me and said, "I think I prefer the company anyway." I was 27 years old. I had never been spoken to quite like that at one of those events where most conversations orbited weather and property values and whose renovation had come in under budget. 6 months later, we were married in my mother's garden in Brentwood, under a white oak tree that had stood there since before the Civil War. My father, Colonel James Beaufort, retired Army, quiet man, precise man, walked me to the altar and pressed my hand once before releasing me. I thought that was love. I thought letting go was the whole point. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't understand for nearly 3 decades, was that my father pressed my hand for a different reason entirely. He was telling me he was paying attention, even when I stopped, even when I convinced myself that trusting someone completely was the same thing as loving them well. Warren Calloway's was 3 years younger than Thomas and had never forgiven the world for it. Not openly. Warren wasn't built for openness. He was built for patience of the wrong kind. The kind that waits for opportunity rather than earns it. He had the same good looks as Thomas, the same easy smile, the same ability to fill a room with warmth that you later realized had been entirely calculated. He disliked me before he found a reason to. I understood that instinctively at the very first Thanksgiving, when Warren passed the sweet potatoes and complimented my cooking with blushing, with just enough pause before the word cooking to make the compliment something else entirely. Thomas never noticed, or he noticed and decided not to. I spent 29 years learning the difference between those two things. They look almost identical from the inside of a marriage. The silence of a man who doesn't hear, The silence of a man who hears and chooses the easier path. Warren had always wanted what belonged to his brother, the company, the house, the life Thomas built, and the woman at the center of it who, if removed cleanly enough, would leave no one to object. He had always wanted the keys. It just took him 29 years to find a way to take them. Warren inserted himself gradually, the way cold air moves under a door. You don't feel it all at once. You just notice eventually that the room has changed temperature. He joined Thomas's real estate development firm in 2003. A good business decision, Thomas told me over dinner. Family keeps things stable. I said nothing, because I had been raised in the particular tradition of Southern women who absorb their doubts quietly and call it grace. By 2010, Warren's name was on half the company's major contracts. By 2015, Thomas had begun looking at me differently at dinner, not coldly, just from a greater distance than before, like a man hearing his own thoughts in someone else's voice and finding the translation more comfortable than the original. I know now whose voice that was. The most dangerous thieves are not the ones who break the window. They're the ones who convince you to hand them the key. I sat in the hotel parking lot for 11 minutes, not because I was paralyzed, because some old and quiet part of me, some part that had watched my father read every document twice before touching a pen, understood suddenly that what I did in the next hour mattered enormously. A driveway confrontation would accomplish nothing. Anger would accomplish nothing. I had enough years behind me to know that the loudest response is almost never the right one. So I drove away. I called my attorney. Her name was Sandra Reeves, and I had retained her 8 months earlier. Not for a divorce. I hadn't been planning for that consciously. Not yet. But because that previous spring, Thomas had begun asking me to sign refinancing documents I hadn't reviewed. He would slide them across the kitchen counter just too casually, always when I was doing something else, always with a pen already in hand. "You don't need to read the whole thing," he said once. "It's just standard language." My father's voice surfaced immediately in my memory. There is no such thing as standard language when someone else benefits from your signature. I had smiled at Thomas and signed nothing. The next day, I called Sandra. 8 months later, standing in a hotel lobby with my overnight bag still in my trunk, I was grateful for that instinct. Grateful that some quiet part of me had listened to a voice I almost talked myself out of hearing. Sandra answered on the second ring. "The locks have been changed," I said. A pause. Then, "On the Brentwood house?" "Yes." "Grace," she said, "don't sign anything. Don't go back inside. And call your father's estate attorney first thing tomorrow morning." I almost told her my father had been dead for 2 years, but Sandra already knew that. "His name is Arthur Holt," she said. "He's been waiting for your call." Arthur Holt's office was on Church Street in downtown Nashville, on the 3rd floor of a building that still had the original tin ceilings from 1911. He was 73 years old, small-framed, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent his career reading between lines that other people wrote carelessly. He reminded me of my father in the way that only certain kinds of quiet men resemble each other. Not in appearance, but in the particular quality of their stillness. He had worked with my father for 26 years. I arrived at 9 o'clock with Sandra beside me. Arthur was already at his desk. A leather folder open in front of him, 2 coffee cups waiting. He stood when I entered. "Grace," he said quietly, "I've thought about this meeting for a long time." There was something in the way he said it that made the back of my throat tighten, not with dread. With something harder to name, the feeling of arriving somewhere that has been expecting you. He slid a cream-colored envelope across the desk. My father's handwriting, 3 words on the front. For Grace. Finally. "He left this 2 months before he passed," Arthur said. "The instructions were very specific. It was only to be delivered if Warren Calloway became a direct threat to your marriage, your property, or your financial security." I looked at the envelope for a long moment, then at Arthur. "He knew this was coming?" Arthur considered the question with the precision of a man who had weighed it carefully long before I arrived. Your father was an exceptionally observant man, he said. He didn't know the specific circumstances, but he knew enough about the people involved to prepare for them. He folded his hands. The question now is whether you are ready to hear what he prepared for you. My father's handwriting was slow and deliberate on the page. He had always written the way he spoke, without waste, without decoration, with the particular economy of a man who had learned in 30 years of legal practice that every extra word was a hiding place for ambiguity. Grace, if you are reading this, then something I hoped would never happen has happened. I want you to know I take no pleasure in having been right about this. I have watched Warren Calloway for 29 years. I have never said this to you directly, because a father who criticizes his daughter's family without documented evidence loses the daughter before he can protect her. So I watched, I documented, and I built something that would stand up whether or not you ever believed it was necessary. There are 3 things you need to understand before you speak to anyone, sign anything, or agree to anything. First, the house on Turnberry Lane. When you and Thomas refinanced in 2009, the original deed was restructured in Thomas's name alone. I noticed this during a routine financial conversation with your accountant, whom I had lunch with occasionally. You told me not to worry when I raised it. So I worried quietly instead, and I acted accordingly. In 2014, Thomas's expansion project in Green Hills was severely undercapitalized. He needed bridge financing quickly. I provided it a personal loan, properly documented and legally recorded. As a condition of that financing, I required a deed restructuring to reflect a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship and an embedded homestead protection clause in your name. Thomas signed the addendum without reading it fully, because men who are entirely certain of their position in a marriage rarely read the fine print of the documents that secure it. He was grateful for the money and impatient to proceed. I was patient. That addendum contains a protected homestead provision in your sole favor. The house on Turnberry Lane cannot be sold, transferred, listed, or leased without your written, notarized consent. Not Thomas's attorney, not any real estate agent he retained, not Warren. Yours alone, as it should have been from the beginning. The words moved through me in a wave that had no single name. Arthur slid the deed across the desk without speaking, tabbed at 3 sections with small yellow flags. My father's signature alongside mine, a name I hadn't been asked to add, that had been quietly placed there on my behalf, in my protection 2 years before my father died. Language I had never been shown. Because Thomas had always handled the financial paperwork. Because I had let him. Because I was a woman from a certain generation who had been quietly, consistently, lovingly taught that trusting someone completely was the same thing as loving them well. That was the lie I had lived inside for 29 years. And my father had seen it clearly from across a dinner table and said nothing aloud and everything in writing. He had left me a key. He just hadn't told me where the door was. He had trusted me to find it when I needed it. I sat with that for a long moment. And then something else clarified, slowly. The way early light moves across a room before you realize the darkness has already ended. Warren had spent years being patient, methodical, working quietly in the background, moving pieces, waiting. I had always thought of that patience as his great advantage, the thing no one could match. But my father had matched it, exactly, and then exceeded it. Both men had worked in silence for years. Both had planned without announcing themselves. Both had operated where no one was looking. But one had spent those years building something that could take. The other had spent those same years building something that could protect. Same virtue, opposite direction. If this story is worth continuing, there is a small button below that helps it reach someone who needs to hear it. I am grateful you are here. I don't know how long I sat there before Arthur spoke again. The tin ceiling above me was perfectly still. Outside, Nashville moved at its ordinary pace. Sandra was writing notes steadily beside me. Arthur waited until her pen paused. "There's more," he said, without apology. I looked back at the letter. Second, the Callaway Group accounts. "I will be direct, Grace, because I no longer have the luxury of time. And because you have always deserved directness, even when the people around you chose convenience instead. In 2017, Thomas told you the investment portfolio had suffered significant losses. He told you the vacation property in Destin would need to be liquidated. He told you the household accounts would need to be consolidated for the foreseeable future. He used the word temporary several times. He looked genuinely worried. He may have been genuinely worried, but the losses were not what caused the worry. In early 2017, Warren established a private holding company called Stoneleigh Capital Partners, incorporated in Delaware, registered to a mailbox facility in downtown Nashville. Between March and November of that year, 9 wire transfers moved from your joint marital investment accounts into Stoneleigh's operating account. The total was approximately $310,000. I have documented all 9 transfers. Arthur has the originals and 3 independent copies. $310,000. I set the letter down on the desk, flat, with both hands, because my hands had started to tremble and I didn't want Arthur or Sandra to see. Not from grief, not from anger, from the specific, cold clarity of understanding, something you had half known for years, but never permitted yourself to complete. Thomas hadn't lost money in the market. He had told me he'd lost money in the market. And while I was managing our household, raising our children, attending every school event and charity dinner and neighborhood association meetings on Thomas's arm, smiling in photographs that still hung on the walls of a house I had just been locked out of. While I was doing all of that, someone had been moving the money 9 times, methodically, into a company I had never heard of. I thought of my father's voice from years ago, patient and unhurried, talking about something I had assumed was abstract. Most human suffering comes from people who trust completely and verify never. I had thought he was speaking about contracts, about legal documents, about other people's lives. He was talking about mine. Arthur refilled my coffee without asking. I picked up the letter again. Third, and this is the one that will matter most in the days ahead, and also the one I am most sorry to have to tell you. When you were 31 years old and your mother died, she left you $95,000. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Enough to feel like her presence in your future, even when she could not be there herself. You told me, 3 years after her death, that you and Thomas had used that money to stabilize the business during the 2002 downturn. You said it quietly, Grace, the way you say things you feel vaguely ashamed of without being able to explain why, as though the money had been wasted rather than taken. I documented that transfer at the time. Thomas framed it as a mutual decision made under pressure. It was not a mutual decision. I have a recorded telephone conversation. And I ask you to forgive me because I know this will surprise you, from September of 2002, in which Warren explicitly advises Thomas to move your inheritance before you have time to register it as a separate marital asset. Use it before she formalizes it. Those were his words. Your mother's $95,000 did not save Thomas's business. It was absorbed almost immediately into accounts connected to what would eventually become the Stoneleigh structure. The business was rescued by a separate bank loan arranged by Warren, using your inheritance as undisclosed collateral. Your mother's money built something that profited Warren Callaway for 20 years, and you were never told, and I am sorry. And I should have found a way to tell you myself while I was still here to say it. I folded the letter, placed it carefully in my lap. The tin ceiling above me was perfectly still. Sandra had stopped writing entirely. Arthur sat with his hands folded, watching me with the expression of a man who had been carrying someone else's grief for 2 years and was only now, finally, at the correct moment, able to set it down. I thought about my mother. She had died at 58 from a diagnosis that moved faster than anyone expected. She left me her kitchen table, her gardening books, her mother's pearl earrings, and $95,000 that I had watched disappear into a marriage I thought I was saving. I thought about Warren's voice on a recording my father had kept for 22 years. Use it before she formalizes it. Not Thomas's idea. Warren's. Again, always Warren. Always the voice in the room that Thomas mistook for his own judgment. I sat in Arthur's office for a long time without speaking, and I thought about my father, sitting in his study in his final months, unable to tell me what he knew, because telling me would have meant asking me to believe something I wasn't ready to believe. So he built the floor instead. He built it quietly, patiently, without credit, without announcement, and he trusted me to be strong enough to stand on it when the time came. I thought I understood love. I had no idea. Thomas called me 11 times the day after I found the locksmith. On the 12th call, he left a voicemail. His voice was measured, prearranged. The voice of a man who had rehearsed what calm sounds like and was delivering the performance from memory. Grace, I know you've been home and seen the situation with the house. I should have spoken with you directly beforehand. I'm sorry about how this happened, but there are legal timelines involved, and we need to talk about next steps. A pause. Then, Warren thinks it's important that we move quickly. Warren thinks. 29 years of marriage, 12 missed calls. And the explanation contained Warren's opinion like a stone in a shoe. I played the voicemail twice. Then I called Sandra. Set a meeting, I told her. Thomas, his attorney, a conference room, the day after tomorrow. A brief pause. And Warren? I thought about the recording my father had kept for 22 years. I thought about 9 wire transfers into a company that existed only to hold what was mine. I thought about a man who had stood in my doorway and looked at me and looked away. Especially Warren, I said. The night before the meeting, Thomas called. It was after 10. I was sitting at the hotel desk going over the documents Arthur had prepared, and when I saw his name on the screen, I almost didn't answer. I answered. His voice was low. Not angry. Something worse than angry, carefully calculated. Warren thinks we should handle this privately, he said, outside of attorneys. The 3 of us, somewhere quiet. He says there's a way to resolve this without everything becoming a public matter. I held the phone and looked at the deed on the desk in front of me, the yellow flag over my father's signature. Does Warren know about the homestead provision? I asked. Silence. Does he know about the Stoneleigh documentation? More silence, long enough that I could hear him breathing. Thomas, I said quietly, I'll see you in the conference room tomorrow morning. I hung up. I turned back to the documents. Outside the hotel window, Nashville was fully lit and completely indifferent to what was about to happen inside one conference room on the 8th floor. I went to sleep at midnight. I was not afraid. I was ready. The conference room at Sandra's firm was on the 8th floor, overlooking the Cumberland River on a clear October morning. Thomas arrived first, a CA suit, looking like a man who had slept adequately and expected to continue doing so. He nodded at me in the way that felt practiced, controlled. The nod of a man who had been coached on how to appear reasonable in a room where he suspected he was not. Warren arrived 3 minutes later in a navy suit, one ankle crossed over his knee, before he had fully settled into the chair, a posture that occupied space confidently. The posture of a man accustomed to controlling rooms without technically leading them. Their attorney, a younger man named Finley, who kept rearranging his folders as though the correct order might improve his prospects, sat at the far end of the table. I sat directly across from Thomas. Arthur Holt sat on my left. Sandra sat on my right. For a moment, nobody spoke. The river moved below us. A barge passed slowly beneath the bridge. Then Thomas leaned forward slightly, with his hands flat on the table. Grace, before anything else, I want you to know that this didn't have to become adversarial. I wanted to handle this with dignity. How did you intend to handle it? I asked. He glanced at Warren involuntarily, then back to me, quietly, fairly, with minimal disruption. Is that what Warren suggested? Warren smiled. The particular smile he had been deploying at family gatherings for 2 decades. Patient, practiced, carrying just enough warmth to be indistinguishable from genuine kindness if you weren't paying attention. Grace, no need to frame this as adversarial, he said. Someone changed the locks on my home, I said pleasantly. That was a logistical decision. While I was 300 miles away visiting our daughter. Thomas had every legal right to remove me from my own home. Arthur slid the deed across the table. Warren stopped mid-sentence. The room changed immediately, the way a room changes when a window opens that someone was certain was sealed. Thomas stared at the document, then at Arthur, then at me. Where did this come from? My father prepared it, I said, in 2014, when you needed bridge financing for the Green Hills expansion. Thomas reached for the document and flipped to the addendum. I watched his face as he read. Confusion first. Then, the particular expression that arrives when a man realizes he signed something without understanding it. Not quite anger, but the specific humiliation of having trusted that someone else's convenience was the same as his protection. There is a homestead provision, Arthur said calmly. Mrs. Calloway's written consent is required for any property transfer, sale, or listing. The house cannot change hands without her notarized signature. Finley grabbed the document and began reading with the focused urgency of a man hoping to find a technical error. Warren had not moved. I looked at him directly. It gets more interesting, I said. Arthur placed the Stoneleigh Capital Partners documentation on the table. 9 wire transfers. Dates, amounts, account origins. The Delaware Incorporation papers. Warren's name. His signature on the operating agreement. His registered agent. Thomas turned his head toward his brother. Slowly. The kind of slow turn that happens when a man needs a moment to construct an expression that doesn't reveal what he already suspects. Warren. Warren's smile had not disappeared, but it had changed quality. The way expensive material changes when it gets wet. Still present, still polished, but something underneath it showing through for the first time. Those accounts were restructured for tax optimization purposes. I've explained this to you before, Thomas. You never told me about Stoneleigh. The detailed mechanics weren't relevant to. $310,000, Thomas said. His voice was very quiet, quieter than anything else in the room. From our joint accounts, into a company I didn't know existed, with your signature on the incorporation documents. Warren recrossed his ankles. A small physical adjustment. The micro-movement of a body that has been very still for too long suddenly needing to be in motion. I was protecting the assets, Warren said. Standard practice during contested divorce proceedings. If Grace had gotten everything into litigation, protecting them in your company, Sandra said. It was not a question. For the family's benefit. Which family? Thomas asked. The room went entirely still. Outside the windows, Nashville moved at its ordinary pace. A boat on the river, traffic on the bridge. A city conducting its business with complete indifference to the fact that a man was finally seeing clearly something he had been refusing to see for years. Thomas stood up slowly, not dramatically, the way a man stands when he needs air and the room has stopped providing it. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to everyone. You told me Grace would take everything, he said to the glass. She would have. You told me she was going to clean us out if I waited. His voice was quiet still, but changed. You've been telling me that for 2 years, that I had to move quickly. That hesitation would cost me everything. He turned around. He looked at his brother with the particular expression of a man who has finally assembled a picture he had been avoiding assembling. And while I was listening to you, Thomas said, you moved it yourself. Warren's composure broke on that sentence. Not completely, but enough. Enough for me to see beneath it, finally, after 29 years, the smallness of the thing that had been slowly, methodically dismantling my marriage. Not brilliance, not even malice in its grandest form, just a man who had always wanted what his brother had. and had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. My father had named it precisely. Warren never wanted Thomas to be happy. He wanted to be Thomas. Greed dressed in family loyalty. Wearing it so long it had begun to believe the costume. Arthur placed one final item on the table. A USB drive. Small, ordinary looking. The kind of thing that sits in a desk drawer for years before anyone understands what it contains. Finley stared at it the way people stare at things they have hoped would never materialize. "This contains a recording," Arthur said, from September 2002. A telephone conversation between Thomas Calloway and Warren Calloway, during which Warren explicitly advised Thomas to transfer Grace's inheritance from her mother's estate before she had the opportunity to register it as a separate marital asset. The sentence settled over the table like weather. "That is 22 years old," Warren said immediately, his voice recovering its composure with impressive speed. "That is entirely. It establishes intent," Sandra said, "regarding the origination of the financial pattern we are documenting today and the premeditated nature of the asset transfers." Warren turned to Finley. "Can they use it?" Finley's expression answered before his words did. "I would need to review the recording circumstances. My father was a party to that call," I said. "He was consulting on the financing structure at the time. The recording is entirely legal." Warren looked at me. For the first time in 29 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings and carefully managed encounters, I saw what was actually behind the smile. Not anger, not contempt, fear, real fear. The kind that arrives when a person who has operated from hidden positions of advantage for decades suddenly finds themselves entirely visible. Thomas sat back down slowly. He looked at the USB drive for a long moment. Then he looked at me across the table, and I saw something in his face that I recognized from a very long time ago. The man from the charity auction in 1992. The one who had bid on a quilt and lost and turned toward me anyway. Except now he looked like a man who had finally arrived somewhere honest after a very long detour. And the cost of the detour was written in his face. "I didn't know about the recording," he said quietly. "I know," I said. I believed him. And strangely, unexpectedly, I discovered that believing him changed almost nothing at all, because the recording was 22 years old. And 22 years is not a mistake. It is a direction. The proceedings took 4 months. Warren retained his own attorney the week after the conference room meeting. The speed of it, the immediate self-preservation. Told Thomas everything that the USB drive and the wire transfers and the Delaware Incorporation papers had not quite finished saying. Finley withdrew from representing both brothers 2 weeks into the proceedings. Citing a conflict of interest, he declined to specify publicly. The Stoneleigh Capital Partners transfers were reclassified as unauthorized distributions from the marital estate. $310,000 plus accumulated interest. The Tybee Island property, which Warren had also quietly transferred into Stoneleigh's name 4 months before Thomas placed divorce papers in front of me, was reversed by court order. My mother's $95,000, adjusted for 22 years of documented financial benefit, became a recognized claim against the estate. Sandra was meticulous. Arthur was meticulous. And my father, in his quiet study in the final months of his life, had been meticulous enough for all 3 of us combined. The house on Turnberry Lane did not sell on Warren's timeline or Thomas's timeline. It sold on mine. At a price that reflected 29 years of careful maintenance, 2 full renovations that I had designed and project managed myself, and a garden that had been featured 3 separate times in the Neighborhood Association's spring newsletter. On the morning I signed those papers, the correct papers, the ones I had read myself, with Sandra beside me, I sat alone in the kitchen for a while before picking up the pen. The oak tree in the backyard was losing its October leaves. The same oak tree I had planted from a sapling the year after Abby was born, in a back corner of the yard where Thomas said it would block the afternoon light. I had planted it anyway. I looked at that tree for a long time. Then I signed my name, clearly. in my own handwriting, on my own terms, for the first time in a very long time. Thomas wrote to me once, 5 months after the divorce was finalized. The letter was short, not because he had run out of words. Thomas had never lacked for words, but because I think he finally understood that none of the words available to him were remotely adequate, and that adequacy was the least he owed me. He wrote that Warren had been removed from the Callaway Group by the remaining partners following an internal audit that discovered additional financial irregularities, ones that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with Warren's particular talent for patients of the wrong kind. He wrote that they hadn't spoken since October. He wrote that he understood now what my father had been trying to communicate on the front porch on the day of our wedding, when he shook Thomas's hand for a very long time and said nothing. In the final paragraph, Thomas wrote, "I convinced myself I was protecting the family. What I was actually doing was protecting Warren's version of the family, which had very little room in it for you, and a great deal of room for him. I understand this now. I am sorry it took the complete collapse of everything for me to see it. Your father understood people better than I ever gave him credit for. He understood me better than I understood myself." I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in the drawer of my writing desk alongside my father's letter and my mother's photograph and the deed to the house that had been legally, protectively, quietly mine all along. I never answered. Not because I hadn't forgiven him. Forgiveness, I had learned that year, is something you do for yourself, a door you close quietly so the cold air stops getting in. It doesn't require the other person to be in the room. I had forgiven Thomas. I just no longer needed him to know it. Some chapters end better without a final scene. My phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March. I was on my knees in the back garden, hands in the soil, working on the second row of lavender along the fence. Sandra's voice was carefully neutral. "Warren's been named in the internal audit," she said, formally. "The remaining partners filed with the state yesterday." I looked at the lavender row in front of me, the color of it, the smell of it in the cold morning air. "Okay," I said. "There may be criminal referrals depending on what the audit uncovers." "Okay," a pause. Then Sandra said, a little warmth entering her professional voice, "Your father was extraordinarily thorough, Grace." I smiled at the dirt. "He really was," I said. I hung up and went back to planting. 3 rows of lavender. One for each decade I had spent in a marriage that was slowly, carefully, invisibly becoming someone else's design. The sun moved over the fence. The garden didn't know anything about Warren Callaway. The garden just grew. 1 year later. I am sitting on the porch of the house I bought in East Nashville, a 1920s craftsman on a street lined with oak trees, with a front garden that faces the morning sun and a back porch that catches the evening light at the exacting angle that makes you feel like the day is ending on purpose. It is nothing like Turnberry Lane. It is entirely mine. I planted a garden in April. Not the careful, coordinated garden I had maintained for 29 years. The one that appeared in the neighborhood newsletter. That guests always complimented. That I tended with the particular devotion of a woman channeling her care into something that at least held still. This garden is messier. Sunflowers that grew taller than I expected them to. Tomatoes that sprawl past their cages in every direction. Lavender in a long, impractical row along the fence that I planted because I love lavender, for no other reason, and because having no other reason is enough. My daughter Abby came for a weekend in June. We spent Saturday morning pulling weeds, and she talked about her job and a man she was seriously considering. I listened the way my father used to listen to me, without advice, without implication, without quietly steering toward the conclusion I had already reached. Just paying complete attention. That evening she said, "Mom, you seem different." I asked what she meant. She thought for a moment, then said, "Lighter. Like something you were carrying finally put itself down. I didn't answer immediately. because she was describing something I had been trying to name for months. What do you call it? That specific weight women carry when they have spent years managing the emotional and practical infrastructure of a shared life while being systematically excluded from the decisions that shaped it. What do you call the exhaustion of loving carefully in a space where your love was being converted into a resource rather than returned as a gift? I think you call it gone, and the absence of it feels at first so unfamiliar that you mistake it for loss. Then one morning, you wake up and your shoulders don't hurt. And you make your coffee exactly the way you like it. And you sit on your own porch in the September morning. And you understand what healed actually feels like. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version. Just a Tuesday morning, just your own coffee cup, just the particular stillness of a life no longer organized around someone else's comfort. Arthur Holt came to dinner on a Saturday in September. He brought a bottle of wine from a vineyard in the Shenandoah Valley that my father had always meant to visit and never got to. We sat on the back porch after dinner while Nashville went dark, and the fireflies started their quiet, intermittent signaling in the garden. "Your father asked me something once," Arthur said. "About 8 years ago." He didn't frame it as worry. He said he wanted an outside perspective. I looked at him. He asked what I thought about Thomas. Not about Warren. Not yet. Just Thomas? Arthur was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet in his office. Deliberately. With intention. I said I thought Thomas was a good man who had never learned to be strong without his brother, and that men like that eventually hand the wrong person too much access without realizing what they've handed over. He looked at the garden. Your father nodded and didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "I need to make sure she doesn't lose everything, because he loses himself." I set my glass down on the porch railing. A firefly blinked low in the lavender. "He never told me any of it," I said. "No, he knew you'd defend Thomas. He knew you'd say he was being a protective old man who worried too much." "I would have," I admitted. He knew that too. Arthur smiled slightly. He said protecting you sometimes meant protecting you from your own loyalty. That sentence stayed with me long after Arthur's headlights disappeared down the street. Protecting you from your own loyalty. I had spent 29 years believing that loyalty was the finest thing I possessed. My father had spent those same 29 years understanding that it was also the thing that made me most vulnerable to the people who recognized it and knew how to use it. He hadn't asked me to change. He hadn't warned me in ways I would have resisted. He had simply built a floor beneath the place he feared I might fall through, and trusted me, in the end, to be strong enough to use it. That was the inheritance. Not the deed provision. Not the documentation. Not the $95,000 restored with 22 years of interest. The inheritance was a father who paid attention when I couldn't, and loved me enough to act quietly rather than loudly, and never once asked for credit. Some fathers give their daughters warnings. Mine gave me a floor. The difference between those two things is the difference between watching someone fall and putting something solid beneath them before they do. I understood that now. Standing in a garden I planted for myself. In a house that asked nothing from me but presence. In a life that was, for the first time in longer than I could clearly measure, entirely mine to shape. There is a small oak tree in the corner of the back garden. I bought it at a nursery on Gallatin Road in May, carried it home in the passenger seat with its roots wrapped in burlap, and planted it myself on a Sunday morning, while the birds were still deciding whether the day was worth beginning. It is about 3 feet tall. In 15 years, it will shade the porch. In 50, it will be the kind of tree someone writes a sentence about. I will not see most of what it becomes, but I planted it anyway, because that is what my father did. He planted things he would not see grow. He built floors he would never walk on. He left keys in doors he would never open himself. He wrote letters he would never read aloud. He trusted in a future where the person he loved most would need exactly what he had quiet, patiently, without applause or acknowledgement, made sure was there. I water the oak tree on Tuesday mornings. I don't know exactly why Tuesdays. It just feels like the right day for honoring things that grow slowly and last. One Wednesday morning in October, a locksmith's van pulled up in front of the Jones Street house. I had scheduled the appointment myself. The locksmith was a young man, efficient, cheerful, the kind of person who brings good energy to ordinary work. He finished in under 40 minutes. He packed up his tools, handed me 2 keys on a small metal ring, and asked me to sign a receipt. I stood on my own porch and signed my own name. He drove away. I held the keys for a moment. 2 small pieces of metal, the same object that had started all of it, standing in a driveway in Brentwood, watching a man I didn't know hand something silver to Warren while my overnight bag sat in the trunk and the engine was still running. That morning, someone else had decided who could enter my life. This morning, I decided. I went inside, made coffee, opened every window in the house. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever come home to find that someone has changed the locks on something that was always yours, if you have ever made yourself smaller to keep a piece that only existed because you kept paying for it, if someone in your life is currently moving things quietly without asking you to look, I hope you hear this. Pay attention to the documents. Not because love requires suspicion, but because love that is real does not ask you to be uninformed. Love that is real does not move the furniture while you are away. Love that is real does not need the locks changed before the conversation. And if you are the person who watches quietly, who worries without announcing it, who builds carefully for someone else's future that you may not live to see, keep building the floor. Keep writing the letter. Keep leaving the key where it can be found. Keep paying the kind of attention that does not ask for acknowledgement. Because somewhere, someone you love will stand in a conference room or a driveway or a kitchen at 2 a.m. and find exactly what you put in place. And they will understand, maybe for the first time, what love at its most faithful actually looks like. Not the kind that asks you to shrink. Not the kind that stays only when it's convenient. The kind that builds something solid beneath you before you need it. The kind that was there all along. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story arrived at the right moment, please pass on to someone who may need the reminder. It is never too late to read the fine print on the life you are living. And it is never too late to become the person who holds their own keys. Not anymore. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Has someone ever changed the locks on a part of your life? A marriage, a home, a job, a friendship? While you were busy being present somewhere else? Or are you the person quietly building the floor for someone you love? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.